My Aunt Ruth called me on a Tuesday evening, and for the first 10 minutes it was nothing but easy, familiar noise, her voice drifting between a story about her tomato plants and a complaint about her neighbor's dog. I had my laptop open on the couch, half listening, scrolling through seating arrangements for an event that was still, as far as I knew, a week away. Somewhere in the middle of her sentence about the dog, I cut in without thinking, the way you do when something is sitting close to the surface of your chest and needs somewhere to go. I told her I still hadn't decided what to wear to Camille's engagement party, that I was cutting it close, that I needed to get to a store this weekend before it was too late. Ruth went quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from someone gathering their next thought. It was heavier than that, a silence with weight to it, the sort that changes the temperature of a phone call before either person says another word. "Margot," she said eventually, and something in the way my name came out of her mouth made the back of my neck go cold before she finished. "Honey," she said, "that already happened." For a second I actually laughed, a small confused sound, because my brain simply refused the sentence, tried to file it as a misunderstanding, a wrong date, anything other than what it obviously was. "What do you mean it already happened?" I said. "Saturday?" Ruth said, "4 days ago. I assumed someone had told you." I sat very still on my couch, the laptop glowing uselessly in front of me, half a seating chart still open on the screen for an event that, apparently, had already come and gone without me anywhere near it. "Nobody told me anything." I said, "I would have been there." "You know I would have been there." "I know," Ruth said, and her voice had dropped into something quieter than I had ever heard from her. "Margot, there's something else going on here. And it isn't only about the party. I don't want to get into it over the phone." "What else?" I asked. "Ruth, what aren't you saying?" She hesitated long enough that I could hear her breathing shift on the other end of the line. "I need to see you in person for this part," she said. "I'll explain everything, I promise. I just can't do it like this." Before I could push any further, she told me she loved me, told me she was sorry, and ended the call so quickly I didn't have time to ask another question. I sat there afterward with the phone still warm against my palm, the half-finished seating chart glowing in front of me on a screen I no longer had any reason to look at, and understood, in the slow, sinking way you understand weather turning before the first drop actually lands, that whatever was coming next had very little to do with a party I had simply missed. Sleep never really arrived that night. I kept circling back to the idea that there had to be some ordinary explanation, a mix-up with dates, a miscommunication somewhere down the family chain, some version of the story where I hadn't genuinely been left out of my own sister's engagement party. Around 6 in the morning, I stopped pretending rest was coming and made coffee I barely tasted, then opened Instagram with fingers that weren't entirely steady. Camille's page loaded slowly at first. Then, all at once, a full carousel greeted me, uploaded 4 days earlier, the like count already well past 600. The party had been held at a converted boathouse on the water. String lights looped across old wooden beams. Everything bathed in that late golden light photographers love to chase. I recognized her dress from a photo she had sent me weeks before, asking whether the neckline was too much. I recognized the cake, 3 tiers, the exact piping pattern she had debated with me for 20 minutes on the phone. I recognized the flowers she had picked out after scrolling through dozens of options together on a video call. What I did not find anywhere in that carousel was any trace of my own absence being noticed. There was a group photo near the end, my parents dressed for the occasion, my father's arm slung around my mother's shoulders, like a man with nothing on his mind but pride. Camille glowing at the center with her hand laced through Preston's, and behind them, cousins and aunts and family friends I had known my entire life, every one of them smiling like the evening had unfolded exactly as it should have. Nobody in that photograph looked like anything was missing. I read through the comments anyway, hunting for something I couldn't quite name, some passing mention of me, some question about where I'd gone. Instead, I found congratulations, heart emojis, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years calling it the loveliest night of the season. It wasn't only that I'd been left out, it was that nobody, apparently, had even paused to register the gap where I should have been. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at the wall, doing the thing I always did when a feeling arrived too large to process in one sitting, which was to go quiet and start hunting for facts instead. I had known about this party for 2 full months. I had offered to help twice, and both times Camille told me everything was already handled. There had been no call about a change in plans, no warning, no version of events where I had simply misunderstood the timeline. There had only been silence, followed by my aunt's voice telling me it was already over. Somebody had decided, on purpose, that this party would happen without me in it, and had let me spend 2 months assuming otherwise. I thought about calling my mother immediately, in the raw heat of that first hour, and saying something sharp enough that I couldn't take it back later. My thumb hovered over her name for the better part of a minute before I set the phone down again and walked to the window instead. Watching the city come awake below me, delivery trucks threading through empty streets, the lake catching its first flat light somewhere past the skyline. I had spent 12 years training myself not to react in the heat of the moment, because evidence never lied to you the way feelings sometimes did. So I would call, but only once I trusted my own voice, and only once I had decided exactly what I wanted to hear back. I dialed the house line at 9, knowing my father would already be settled into his recliner with his tablet, and my mother would be finishing her second cup of coffee. Both of them exactly as unbothered as they were every single Saturday of their retired lives. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright and easy. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said. "This is a nice surprise." I kept my own voice level, though it cost me something to do it. "Ruth told me about the party." I said, "I found out from her, not from either of you." The pause that followed was shorter than I expected, more rehearsed than surprised. "I wondered when we'd end up having this conversation," she finally said. Not an apology. Not even a flicker of regret in her tone. Just quiet resignation. As if she'd been waiting for me to catch up to something she'd already decided was settled. My father's voice came in closer to the receiver now, which told me he'd been sitting right there the whole time. "Don't blow this out of proportion," he said. "It was your sister's night. She wanted it easy on herself." "Easy on herself?" I repeated. Meaning what? Exactly. Meaning I would have made it hard. My mother's tone shifted into something I remembered from childhood, gentle on the surface, edged underneath. "You can be a lot sometimes." "Honey," she said, "you ask questions. You notice everything. Camille didn't want to spend her own party worrying about how you might be reading the room. I have never once caused a scene at anything in this family." I said, "Name one time." "Nobody said you caused a scene." My father cut in. "It's more of a presence thing. You carry weight into a room. Margot. Always have." Something in my chest went cold and quiet, the way still water goes hard at the edges, right before it freezes over completely. "We talked it through together," my mother added, as though a family vote made the decision kinder rather than crueler. "Honestly, we assumed you'd be relieved. You're always buried in work. We figured we were doing you a favor." "A favor," I said. "I cleared 2 days off my calendar for this. I already picked out something to wear." "Well," she said, her tone finally cooling into something closer to irritation. "It's done now. No use picking at it. Camille's happy. Preston's wonderful. And I think the healthiest thing we can all do is move past it. Move past it. As if they hadn't sat together in a room and voted to erase me, then dressed the decision up as kindness and handed it back to me as though I should be grateful. I have to go, I said. Margot, don't be like this. I ended the call before she could finish the sentence, and stood there afterward in the quiet of my kitchen, phone still in my hand, realizing I had never once in 34 years hung up on my mother mid-sentence. My hands weren't trembling from sadness. They were trembling from something with a sharper edge, something I hadn't let myself feel toward this particular family in a very long time. And for once, I didn't try to talk myself out of it. I didn't try to sleep again that night. I gave up on the idea entirely somewhere around midnight, when I realized I had been lying in the dark for 2 hours, replaying the same 4 sentences from my mother's mouth. Turning them over and over like stones, I kept expecting to feel different the 10th time I picked them up. You know how you get. You have opinions about everything. We decided you'd be relieved. Let's move forward. Eventually, I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and sat on the couch with the city lights bleeding orange and white through the windows. And I let myself remember things I had spent years carefully not remembering. My 30th birthday. 4 years ago, no dinner, no cake, not even a card that arrived on the actual day, just a text 2 days later that said, "Hope your birthday was good." Sorry things have been crazy. Camille's 30th, the year after mine, had been 50 people and a 3-tier cake and a slideshow set to music, photographed from 6 different angles and posted across every platform she used. I remembered telling myself at the time that it didn't matter, that birthdays were for children, that I wasn't the kind of person who needed a party to feel loved. I believed that story about myself for a long time. I was starting to understand, sitting alone in my dark living room at 1 a.m, that I had built an entire personality around not needing things, because needing things from this particular family had never once gone well for me. I thought about grandmother Vivian's funeral, 3 years back now, and the way my mother had said, to some cousin I couldn't even picture, "Margot's so capable. Nothing rattles her. We never have to worry about her." I remembered how proud that had made me feel in the moment, and how sick it made me feel now, turning it over with new eyes. Capable wasn't a compliment. Capable was a job description. Capable meant nobody had to check on me, because I would handle whatever needed handling, quietly, competently, without asking anyone to hold space for what it cost me. I got up and walked to the window, because the apartment felt too small to hold what I was thinking, and I needed the size of the city to put it in proportion. I had bought this penthouse 4 years ago, after 9 years of a very particular kind of discipline. No vacations that weren't work trips. No new car until the old one actually died. A decade of telling myself that if I just kept building, kept saving, kept being the reliable one, eventually I would have something no one could take from me. The final push had come from an unusually large bonus. The year I helped unwind a 9-figure insurance fraud scheme at my old firm. The kind of case that makes a career and, apparently, buys a corner unit on the 31st floor with floor-to-ceiling glass and a view straight down Lakeshore Drive. I had pictured more than once standing in this exact spot with my family around me. Thanksgiving here, eventually, once I finally furnished the dining room properly. Camille's kids, if she ever had them, running along that hallway. My mother by the window with a book. My father on the balcony with a drink, pretending he understood the market data I'd occasionally talk about over dinner. I had built a shrine, apparently, to a kind of closeness that had never actually existed anywhere except in my own head. The skyline didn't answer any of that. It just sat there, glittering and indifferent, the way it always did. And for once I found that comforting instead of lonely. The city didn't need anything from me. It didn't require me to be smaller, quieter, less intense, less anything. In order to earn its indifference, I stood there until the sky started to go the color of a bruise healing, that early gray before real light. And somewhere in that stretch of hours, I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like arithmetic, the kind of clean, cold calculation I made for a living. Whatever this family had decided about me, I no longer had to accept the terms without examining them first. I had spent 34 years assuming my worth to these people was self-evident. It was time to actually look at the receipts. I pushed my first meeting back by 2 hours, something I couldn't remember doing once in the 4 years since I'd made partner track. Told my assistant only that something personal had come up, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop open to my own banking portal, the way I would open a client's financials when a number on the page didn't add up. I approached it exactly like that, methodical, unemotional, somebody else's account, not my own life. The first thing I found was a recurring transfer of $400 a month, labeled Parents, Property Tax Escrow. I remembered setting that up 7 years ago, after my father complained one Thanksgiving that the assessment on the house had gone up again and money was tight since his pension hadn't kept pace. I had told myself it was temporary, a bridge, until things settled. 7 years and roughly $33,600 later, it had never once been temporary. It had simply become part of the architecture of my monthly budget. Invisible the way a support beam is invisible until you actually go looking for it. Then I found the loan payment for Camille's graduate program, a little over $200 every month for the past 5 years. Money I had agreed to cover for, in her words, just the first year while she got on her feet after the program ended. 5 years, over $12,000. Quietly renewing itself every month like a subscription nobody remembered signing up for. Then the one that made my jaw actually tighten. A monthly contribution of $150 to something labeled, in my own handwriting from years ago, Family Emergency Fund, an account I had set up after my grandmother's hospital stay, so there would always be cash available if something happened again. I checked the balance. $11,000 had accumulated there over the years, and a scroll through the withdrawal history showed it had been drawn down 4 separate times, twice for what the notes called Camille's car repairs, once for a family vacation deposit I had never been invited on, and once, 8 months ago, for an amount I didn't recognize at all, simply labeled miscellaneous, no further explanation attached. I sat with that number for a long moment. Miscellaneous. $2,000 of a fund I had built for actual emergencies, spent on something nobody had bothered to name, let alone ask my permission for. I kept scrolling. A subscription to 3 different streaming services, billed to a card I barely used anymore. All 3 logged into under my mother's profile information. A recurring charge for my father's golf club membership, $400 a quarter, which I now remembered agreeing to cover just once. The year he was between pensions, an arrangement that had apparently auto-renewed itself for 3 straight years without anyone thinking to mention it to me. By the time I finished tallying everything on a legal pad beside my laptop, the number sitting at the bottom of the page read just over $58,000, spread out across 7 years, in payments so small and so regular that I had genuinely stopped noticing them. The way you stop noticing a low hum in a room until someone finally points it out, and then you can't hear anything else. I sat back in my chair and looked at that number for a long time. $58,000. Not stolen, exactly. Nothing forged, nothing illegal, nothing I could take to anyone and call a crime. Just years of quiet, cumulative generosity that nobody had ever once acknowledged. Treated instead as though it were simply the natural order of things. The responsible sister paying, the rest of the family receiving. World without end. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened my bank's app, and one by one, calmly, the same way I would shut down a compromised account during a fraud investigation, I canceled every single recurring transfer, the property tax escrow, the loan payment, the streaming subscriptions, the golf membership. I left the emergency fund open because some stubborn part of me still believed in the idea of it. But I changed the account permissions so no one but me could touch it again. I didn't send a text explaining any of it. I didn't leave a voicemail. I simply stopped, the way you stop pouring water into a cup that has been overflowing onto the floor for years, while everyone around you insists the floor has always looked like that. When I finally closed my laptop, the kitchen had gone fully bright with mid-morning light, and I felt, for the first time since Ruth's phone call, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It felt more like clarity, cold, exact, undeniable clarity, the kind I usually only felt at the end of a long audit, staring at a spreadsheet that finally, after weeks of digging, told the truth. Priya texted me before I had a chance to text her, which was fairly typical. "Dinner tonight." Her message read, "Don't argue. Bring your appetite and whatever's happening in your face right now." I hadn't told her anything yet. She had simply looked at one photo I'd posted weeks earlier of Camille's save the date and, apparently, filed away a mental note to check on me the moment anything felt off. That was Priya, 12 years of friendship, going back to a shared apartment in graduate school, and she still had an instinct for the exact week my family was going to do something that required a debrief. We met at the small Vietnamese place near her apartment in Logan Square. The one with the plastic patio chairs and the fiao that made you forget the chairs were plastic. She was already at our usual table when I arrived, wearing the blazer she clearly hadn't bothered to change out of after work, a reporter's notebook still visible in her bag even though she hadn't opened a laptop in hours. "You look like a woman who found a body," she said, by way of greeting. "Close," I said, and sat down across from her. I told her everything. Start to finish. In the flat. Sequenced way, I told her most things. The way that let me get through it without my voice doing anything embarrassing. The party. Ruth's phone call. The Instagram photos at 6 in the morning. My parents' explanation. That particular word, energy, sitting between us on the table like something spoiled. Priya didn't interrupt once. She had a way of listening that made you feel like you were being cross-examined and comforted at the same time, her eyes tracking every detail, occasionally jotting something on a napkin out of pure professional habit, even though this had nothing to do with any story she was working. When I finished, she sat back and was quiet for a moment, which, for Priya, was its own kind of statement. "Here's what bothers me," she said finally. "Not the excuse. Families give bad excuses for exclusion all the time. That's basically what families do. What bothers me is the effort. Coordinating a story across an entire extended family, briefing people in advance, having your mother ready with a whole explanation the second Ruth let it slip. That's not an oversight. Margot, that's a communications plan. People don't build communications plans around something as small as your intensity making Camille uncomfortable." I turned my water glass slowly on the table, not really looking at her. Ruth said there's something else. I told her, she wouldn't say what. Just that it's bigger than the party. Priya's expression sharpened in the particular way it did whenever a source told her there was more to a story than they were willing to say on the record. "In my experience," she said, "when someone tells you there's more but they need to see your face to say it, there usually is a lot more, and it's usually not good." I told her about the money next, about the spreadsheet I'd built that morning, the $58,000 spread quietly across 7 years, the $2,000 withdrawal from the emergency fund labeled nothing but miscellaneous, Priya's mouth went tight at that number, the specific expression she wore when she was angry on someone else's behalf, which was somehow always more intense than being angry on her own. "You know what that number tells me," she said. "It tells me you've been the load-bearing wall in that family for years, and nobody ever bothered to check if the wall was holding up okay. And now that you finally pulled a couple of boards out, they're going to act shocked the house creaked." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd managed in almost 24 hours, short and a little rough at the edges. "So what do I do?" I asked her. Do I let it go? Do I demand a real apology? Do I just accept that this is who they are and adjust my expectations accordingly? Priya reached across the table and put her hand briefly over mine, which for her, a woman who generally treated physical affection as an inefficient use of time, was practically a speech in itself. "You do what you always do when something doesn't add up," she said. "You follow the thread until you find out what it's actually attached to. Don't accept the first explanation. You wouldn't accept it from a client's financials, and you shouldn't accept it from your own family. Whatever Ruth is sitting on, go find out what it is before you decide how angry to be. You might be about to find out you haven't even gotten to the real story yet." I sat with that for a moment, the noise of the restaurant washing over us, the smell of broth and charred onion drifting from the kitchen. She was right, and some part of me had already known it since the moment Ruth's voice cracked on the word sorry the night before. Whatever this was, the party had only been the opening page. Ruth texted me 2 days after Priya's warning. 2 days I spent mostly at work, burying myself in a client audit that required exactly the kind of numbing, detail-oriented focus I needed right then. Her message came through just after 6 in the evening, while I was still at my desk. "Can we meet Saturday? In person?" I'll explain everything I know. I read it 3 times before I answered, the way I read most things that mattered, checking each word for whatever might be hiding underneath it. Ruth wasn't a dramatic person. In 34 years, I couldn't remember her ever asking for an in-person meeting about anything more serious than a recipe. If she needed to see my face for this conversation, it meant she needed to watch how I took the news, which meant the news itself was something she expected to land hard. I told her yes, obviously, and she sent back an address, a small diner out in Evanston, a neighborhood far enough from where either of us actually lived that I understood, without her having to say it, that she wanted privacy. Nobody we knew would wander past a window and recognize us there. Saturday morning arrived gray and a little raw, the kind of Chicago morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain, and I found myself unusually nervous on the drive out, my hands a little too tight on the wheel for a simple trip to a diner. I kept trying to guess what she might say, running through possibilities the way I would run through hypotheses on a case before I had enough evidence to commit to one. Maybe it was about my grandmother's estate, something about the will that had never been fully settled. Maybe it was something about my parents' finances, some detail Ruth had noticed as my mother's sister, close enough to see things the rest of us weren't shown. I thought, too, about Ruth herself, about the particular role she'd always occupied at the edges of our family gatherings. She was the one who noticed things and rarely said anything. The quiet observer who watched my mother's dynamics with a kind of careful distance, as though she'd learned a long time ago that speaking up in this family cost more than it was worth. I remembered, as a teenager, catching her once in the kitchen after a particularly brutal exchange between my parents and me over some forgotten slight, and the way she'd squeezed my shoulder without saying a word. The closest thing to solidarity anyone in that house had ever offered me. If Ruth was finally speaking up now, after decades of careful silence, it meant something had shifted in her. Some threshold crossed that she could no longer walk past without saying anything. The diner came into view a little before 11. A squat building with a faded sign and a parking lot half empty on a Saturday morning, Exactly the kind of place where two women having a difficult conversation could sit undisturbed for as long as they needed. I parked, sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, and watched the door, trying to settle whatever was rising in my chest before I walked inside and let it show on my face. Whatever this was, I told myself I would receive it the way I received everything in my professional life, calmly, methodically, one fact at a time, no matter how much any single fact might cost me. I got out of the car, crossed the lot, and pushed open the door. Ruth had already claimed a booth near the back by the time I walked in, a coffee cup sitting untouched in front of her, both hands wrapped around it as though she needed somewhere to put her nervous energy. She looked older than she had at a cousin's baby shower a few months earlier, though I couldn't have named exactly what had changed. Something around her eyes, maybe. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a decision far too long and still hasn't found a way to set it down. I settled into the seat across from her. A waitress appeared briefly, and I ordered coffee I had no intention of finishing, mostly so there would be something occupying the space between us besides silence. "There's something you need to hear before anything else," Ruth started, once the waitress had gone. "I've stayed quiet about this for way too long, and that's on me." "I'm sorry. Margot, just tell me," I said. "Whatever it is?" She began with the party, working her way toward the heavier part, I think. The way people ease into cold water instead of diving straight in. A few months back, at the shower planning. "I ended up in your mother's hallway." She said, "The door wasn't shut all the way. I wasn't trying to hear anything, I promise you that. But Camille was upset in there, really worked up, and she had no idea I was standing right outside." "What was she upset about?" I asked, my stomach already tightening in anticipation of an answer some part of me had half expected. Ruth's jaw set before the words came out. "She told your mother she didn't want you at the wedding at the party," she corrected herself quickly. "Said you always end up being the center of attention without even trying. Said people would look at her and then look at you and she'd feel like the disappointment standing next to the golden child." I sat back against the booth, and the diner suddenly felt too warm, the overhead lights pressing down harder than they had a minute earlier. This hadn't come from our parents making some vague decision on my behalf. It had come from my own sister, specifically and on purpose, asking not to have me anywhere near her that night. I've never once made anything about myself at a single family event. I said, mostly to myself. I plan things, I pay for things. I show up early and leave last and smile through every minute of it. "I know you do," Ruth said, gentle now, almost begging me to understand. "And I think that's exactly why this happened. Camille has envied you for years, honey. Probably longer than either of us realized. You built a life nobody handed you, and instead of that pushing her forward, it just curdled into something uglier every year that passed. Your parents never once told her that wasn't fair to you. They just took whichever path cost them the least effort." "The path that cost everyone but me," I said, and the bitterness in my own voice surprised me. I'd been the difficult one this whole time, apparently, simply for existing in a way nobody else in that family had matched. "So the story about a gift and a work emergency," I said slowly. "None of it was real. Your mother came up with all of it." Ruth confirmed, told the whole party you'd had something urgent hit at the firm, that you'd sent flowers, that you sent your love. She even had a specific gift in mind if anyone asked. Some crystal piece from a shop downtown. She had the whole thing memorized. Margot rehearsed. Nobody blinked twice, because it fit exactly what this family already says about you. Margot's always buried in work. Margot's always got something going on. "Did anyone question it?" I asked. Did anyone find it strange? A couple people wondered out loud. Ruth admitted, Your cousin Denise asked where you'd gotten to. Your mother shut that down fast, claimed you'd pulled back from everyone recently and needed room to sort yourself out. The room felt like it tilted slightly. They hadn't simply left me out. They had rewritten the entire narrative afterward, so that I became the one pulling away, the one choosing the distance, when no version of distance had ever actually been offered to me as a choice in the first place. There's more, isn't there? I said, watching her face carefully now. You told me on the phone this wasn't only about the party. Ruth's grip tightened around her cup again, and for the first time since I'd sat down, what crossed her face looked less like guilt and more like genuine fear. There's more, she said quietly. And it's a great deal worse than this. Worse, I repeated. What could possibly be worse than my own sister asking to be spared the sight of me? Ruth glanced toward the diner's front window, toward the mostly empty parking lot. The way people glance around a room when they're about to say something they've decided cannot be unsaid once it leaves their mouth. It's about your grandmother, she said finally, about Vivian's land up in Door County. I felt something cold move through me at the mention of that place. The acreage on the peninsula my grandmother had owned for almost 50 years. The little house with the screened porch where I'd spent every August of my childhood catching frogs at the water's edge while she sat with a paperback and pretended not to watch me too closely. She had died 3 years ago, and in all the grief and logistics that followed, I had genuinely believed the estate had been settled cleanly. The land simply absorbed into whatever arrangement my parents had made among themselves. What about it? I asked, when Ruth didn't continue right away. I was going through some old boxes at my place a few weeks ago. Ruth said, Things I'd kept after your grandmother passed. Papers your mother didn't want cluttering up her house. And I found some documents, financial documents, loan paperwork, Margot, and I don't fully understand all of it, but I understand enough to know it didn't look right. Loan paperwork, I repeated slowly, on the Door County property. Ruth nodded, and her hand, I noticed, had started to tremble slightly around the handle of her coffee cup. I didn't want to say anything until I understood more of it myself. She said, I'm not good with financial things. You know that. But there were numbers on those pages that made my stomach turn. And there was a signature on one of them that didn't look like it belonged there. Whose signature? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to suspect the answer before I finished the question, the way you sometimes know the ending of a case before you've technically proven it. Yours, Ruth said quietly. Or something that was supposed to pass for yours. The diner noise around us seemed to recede, the clatter of dishes, the low murmur of the few other tables, all of it fading into a kind of dull static while I sat there trying to make the sentence mean something other than what it obviously meant. I never signed anything related to that property. I said, I haven't touched any paperwork about grandmother's estate since the funeral. My understanding was always that the land had been folded into the general estate settlement, that there was nothing separate to sign. I don't know all the details, Ruth said. I only found a handful of pages, not the whole file. But there was a loan document with a signature that says Margot Ellison, dated about 2 years ago, and a dollar amount on it that made me sit down on my kitchen floor when I saw it. How much? I asked, my voice coming out flatter than I intended. The particular flatness I used at work when a client told me a number they clearly hoped I would react to with less composure than I actually felt. Ruth hesitated, glancing down at her hands. $500,000, she said, give or take. I didn't understand at first what kind of loan it even was, whether it was against the land itself or something else entirely, but it had your grandmother's address on it, and it had your name on the signature line, and none of it made any sense to me, because as far as I ever knew, that land was supposed to come to you. I sat perfectly still, running the numbers and the timeline in my head, the way I would run a preliminary hypothesis through a case file before I let myself react to anything. 2 years ago. A signature I had never provided. A property that, according to everything I had understood about my grandmother's wishes, should have transferred to me outright and untouched. "I don't have the rest of the file," Ruth said. "I only grabbed those few pages before I lost my nerve and put the box away again. I've been sitting on this for 3 weeks. Margot, telling myself I'd find the right moment. And then the party happened, and I realized I couldn't keep sitting on any of it any longer. Whatever this is, it's bigger than a party you weren't invited to." I reached across the table and, for the first time since I'd sat down, put my hand over hers. The way she used to do for me when I was young enough to still need that kind of gesture explained to me. "I need to see those pages," I said. "All of them, whatever you have. And I need to find out who else has touched that file. Because I promise you, whatever is on that signature line, it isn't mine." Ruth nodded, tears finally slipping loose and tracking down toward her jaw. 3 weeks of guilt visibly draining out of her all at once, now that the words were finally out in the air between us. "I'll bring everything I have," she said. "I should have brought it today. I know. I just wasn't ready to watch your face while you read it." "I'm ready now," I told her. And I meant it in a way I hadn't meant much of anything in the 2 days since Ruth's first phone call. Whatever this was, it had stopped being only about hurt feelings and a missed engagement party. Somewhere in a stack of documents I hadn't seen yet, someone in my own family had apparently decided my name was simply a signature to be borrowed, and I intended to find out exactly who and exactly why, no matter what it cost any of us to get there. The messages started 3 days later, which told me something in itself. It had taken my family that long to notice that $33,000 of accumulated support had simply stopped arriving, a fact I found almost more insulting than the party itself. Money I had sent so consistently, for so many years, that its absence hadn't even registered as a change worth investigating until someone, somewhere, had actually opened a bank statement and looked. My mother's text came first. At 9 in the morning, while I was still at my desk reviewing a client file. The property tax payment didn't come through this month. It read, "Is everything all right with your account?" I looked at that message for a long time before I decided not to answer it at all. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I wanted to say. And I wasn't yet ready to say it in writing, where it could be screenshotted, forwarded, quoted back to me out of context at some future family gathering as evidence of how difficult I'd become. By that afternoon, a second message arrived, this one sharper. "We need to talk about the account situation. Please call when you get a chance." I didn't call. The next morning, my father tried a different approach entirely. A longer message. The kind he only wrote when he'd had time to compose it carefully. "Margot, I don't understand what's happening with these accounts, but I hope you're not doing something rash out of anger. Whatever's going on between you and your sister, punishing this family financially isn't the answer. We've always taken care of each other. I'd hate to see you throw that away over hurt feelings." Punishing, as though $33,000 of quietly funded property taxes had been a favor I owed them by default, rather than a kindness I had extended and was now, apparently, required to extend indefinitely on pain of being called vindictive. Camille's message came last, and it was the one that actually made my hands go still over my keyboard for a moment. "Mom says you cut off the family fund stuff." It read, "Seriously, after everything, you're going to make this about money now. I already feel like garbage about the party. Do you have to make it worse?" I read that message 4 times. and each time I felt something in my chest tighten a little further. She already felt like garbage about the party, not because she had asked specifically, deliberately, to have me erased from it, because the consequences of that choice were now inconveniently touching her own life. In the form of a sister who had finally, after 7 years, stopped quietly bankrolling everyone's comfort without acknowledgement. I sat with all 3 messages open on my phone, side by side, and noticed the thing they all had in common. Not one of them mentioned the party as something that had actually happened to me. Not one of them said the word sorry and meant it as an ending rather than a preamble to their own complaint. Every single message was, in its own way, about their inconvenience, their confusion, their sense that I owed them an explanation for finally noticing my own life. I thought about responding to each of them individually, laying out exactly why I had made the choices I'd made, walking them through the spreadsheet, the 7 years, the $58,000. Some old, deeply conditioned part of me still wanted to explain myself, to make sure they understood I wasn't being cruel, that there was a clean, defensible logic behind every account I'd closed. Instead, I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to the client file in front of me, a fraud case involving a small manufacturing company and an employee who had spent 4 years diverting invoices to a shell account nobody had thought to double-check. There was something almost soothing about it. The clean mechanics of somebody else's deception, laid out in black and white, none of it tangled up with the particular ache of people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. By the end of the day, I had not responded to a single message. I realized as I packed up to leave the office, the first time in my entire adult life, I had let my family sit with unanswered silence instead of rushing in to smooth things over. It didn't feel like triumph exactly. It felt more like holding my breath underwater, testing how long I could stay down there before the old instinct to surface and apologize for existing finally won out. It didn't win out that night. I drove home, poured myself a glass of wine I barely touched, and sat with the silence a while longer, waiting for whatever Ruth was about to hand me, to tell me exactly how deep this particular water actually went. That night, I did something I hadn't done since my early years in forensic accounting, back when I was still building the discipline that would eventually become my entire career. I got out a legal pad, sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and wrote out everything I knew, in order, the way I would build a case file for a client who suspected fraud, but didn't yet have the language to describe what they were feeling. Fact 1. My sister had asked, specifically and deliberately, not to have me at her engagement party, and our parents had agreed to it, then constructed an elaborate cover story to hide that choice from the rest of the family. Fact 2. I had spent 7 years quietly funding portions of my family's life, roughly $58,000 in total, money that had never once been acknowledged, let alone repaid, and had only stopped because I finally noticed and made it stop myself. Fact 3, the one that made my pen hesitate on the page the longest. Somewhere in a box of old papers, there existed a loan document worth roughly $500,000, tied to my grandmother's land in Door County, carrying a signature that claimed to be mine, and was not. I looked at those 3 facts sitting on the page in my own handwriting and understood, with the same cold clarity I brought to every case at work, that they weren't 3 separate problems. They were 3 data points on the same curve, 3 symptoms of a single underlying pattern I hadn't allowed myself to see clearly until tonight. My family had spent years treating me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be honored. Someone whose money, whose time, whose very presence at family events could be quietly used, adjusted, or removed according to whatever was most convenient for everyone else. I thought about my grandmother then, about the particular way she used to look at me across her kitchen table up at the lake house. The summer I was 12 and had just found out my parents had forgotten to pick me up from a friend's house for nearly 3 hours. "You're my steady one," she'd told me, pouring lemonade into a chipped glass she refused to throw away because it had been her own mother's. "Everyone else in this family is a weather vane, turning whichever way the wind blows. You're the foundation, Margot. Don't ever let anyone convince you that being steady means you don't also deserve to be chosen." I hadn't thought about that memory in years. Sitting there now, legal pad in front of me, 3 damning facts written in my own hand. I understood it differently than I ever had before. My grandmother had seen something in this family long before I had the vocabulary to name it myself, and now, somehow, impossibly, her own name and her own land had been dragged into whatever pattern she had apparently spent her whole life quietly trying to protect me from. I decided, sitting there well past midnight with my tea gone completely cold, that I would not accept a simple apology for any of this, not for the party, not for 7 years of unacknowledged support, and certainly not for whatever Ruth was about to hand me involving a signature that wasn't mine. I had spent 3 decades being the reliable one, the responsible one, the daughter who absorbed whatever the family needed, absorbed without complaint. That version of me had just closed her case file for the last time. My phone rang just as I set down my pen. Ruth's name lit up the screen, and something in my chest went very still and very focused all at once. The particular calm that settled over me right before I opened a file I already suspected would change everything. "I'm ready," I said, answering before the second ring finished. "Bring whatever you have." For about 2 days. I let myself believe the cruelest thing my family could do was write me out of my sister's happiest night and lie about it afterward. That belief lasted right up until Ruth walked through my door, set a worn manila envelope on my kitchen table, and slid it toward me without a single word. I hadn't opened it yet. I could already feel the shape of everything about to change my grandmother's name on the front. A dollar figure large enough to end a marriage or a career, and a signature underneath that was supposed to belong to me and did not. Ruth waited until I'd poured us both water before she reached into her bag and set the envelope down between us. The paper soft at the corners from having been handled too many times by someone who kept picking it up and putting it away again without deciding what to do with it. "Take your time," she said. "I'll just sit here." I opened it carefully. The way I open anything at work that might matter more than it looks. Inside were maybe a dozen pages, photocopies mostly, some slightly crooked as though copied in a hurry. The first was a letter on law firm letterhead, addressed to me, dated a little over 2 years ago. "Harrow and Pierce. Estate planning," the header read. A firm name I had genuinely never encountered in my life. Not once, not in any conversation with my parents about my grandmother's affairs. "Dear Ms. Ellison," it began. "Our office represents the estate of Vivian Ellison. Under the terms of her will, the property at 1140 Lakeshore Trail, Door County, Wisconsin, passes to you as its sole heir. Kindly reach out to our firm as soon as possible so we can walk you through the steps needed to complete the transfer of title into your name." I read it twice, then a third time, because the words refused to settle into a shape that matched what I thought I already knew about my grandmother's estate. I remembered the funeral clearly. The folding chairs set up in the backyard because the funeral home's chapel had felt too small and too cold for a woman who had spent her whole life outdoors. I remembered my mother handling the paperwork afterward, or claiming to, waving off my offers to help with a tired smile and a line about not wanting to burden me while I was grieving. "I never got this," I said. Nobody ever told me a letter like this existed. I know, Ruth said quietly. That's the part that scared me most when I found it. Look at the address on the envelope it would have gone to. I flipped the page over, and there it was, printed clean at the top corner where the original mailing label must have been photocopied along with everything else, not my address. My parents' house in Naperville, where I had stayed for almost 2 weeks after the funeral, sorting through logistics with my mother while my father handled what I'd assumed at the time was paperwork none of us wanted to deal with alone. I would have gone back to my own apartment before this ever arrived, I said slowly, working through the timeline out loud, the same way I'd walk a client through a suspicious transaction. Which means somebody at that house opened it. Somebody read a letter addressed to me, in my name, and decided not to hand it over. Ruth didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. And I watched her hands tighten slightly around her water glass. I kept moving through the stack. The next few pages were harder to parse, financial in a way that required more careful reading, but the shape of it became clear the longer I sat with them. A loan application, a property valuation, oddly generous for a house that hadn't been renovated since the 80s, a document labeled Power of Attorney, dated roughly 2 years back, granting someone named Walter Ellison the authority to act on my behalf in all matters concerning the Door County property. I had never granted my father power of attorney over anything in my life. I hadn't even known such a document existed until this exact moment. Sitting at my own kitchen table with my aunt watching my face the way you watch someone reading a diagnosis. At the bottom of that page was a signature line, my name typed above it, and beneath the line, a signature that was close, unnervingly close, close enough that a stranger glancing at it would never think twice. But I had signed my own name tens of thousands of times across 2 decades of professional life, on client files, on court documents, on affidavits that had held up under cross-examination. And I knew instantly, the way you know your own handwriting the second something's off about it, that the loop on the G curved the wrong direction, and the final stroke under the L was too short, cut off half a beat too early, like whoever wrote it had rushed the ending. "This isn't mine," I said, more to myself than to Ruth, setting the page down flat on the table as though it might do something unpredictable if I let it out of my sight. Whoever did this studied my signature. They got close. They didn't get it exactly right. Ruth reached across the table and set her hand over mine, the paper still spread out between us like evidence at a crime scene nobody official had ever examined. "There's a dollar amount further back in the stack," she said gently. "I want you to see it for yourself before I say the number out loud. I've read it maybe 50 times since I found this box, and it still doesn't feel real to me." I turned to the page she meant, and there it was, printed in the clean, indifferent font of a bank's internal system. A home equity loan against the Door County property, funded a little under 2 years ago, $510,000. I sat back in the booth and let the number exist in the air for a moment before I let myself react to it at all. The same discipline I brought to any client meeting where the figures on the page were worse than anyone in the room wanted to admit out loud. $500,000. Borrowed against land that had belonged to my grandmother for nearly 50 years. Using a version of my name that wasn't quite mine. Delivered to an address that wasn't mine either. "I need the rest of this file," I said finally. "Every page you have, even the ones that don't look important. Whoever did this, they didn't do it alone, and I intend to find every single name attached to it before I decide what happens next." I called Harrow and Pierce first thing Monday morning, before I let myself think too hard about what I was about to confirm. A paralegal answered, her voice pleasant and unhurried in the way of someone who had no idea the call she was about to take would unravel 2 years of careful silence inside my family. I gave her my name, told her I was reaching out about my grandmother Vivian Ellison's estate, and mentioned I'd only just come across a letter meant for me years earlier. One I'd never actually received. I could hear her typing on the other end, then a pause, then more typing, the particular rhythm of someone pulling up a file that hadn't been touched in a long time. "Yes," she said finally. "I do see the file. We sent correspondence to you at an address in Naperville, Illinois, about 2 years ago now. Let me just confirm the date for you. That would have been the 14th, about 2 weeks after the date of passing listed on file. That's not my address," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "That's my parents' house. I never lived there as an adult. I was only staying there temporarily, right after my grandmother's funeral. And I'd already gone home by the time you're describing." I could hear her hesitate, the particular hesitation of someone realizing a routine call has quietly become something else. "And on your end?" I asked, "Did the letter ever get a response from anyone?" "Our records show a follow-up call," she said carefully, "a few weeks after we mailed it. From a Walter Ellison, identifying himself as acting on your behalf. He indicated you were dealing with the aftermath of your grandmother's passing and had asked him to manage the estate matters directly. He provided documentation, a power of attorney, and our office had no particular reason to question it at the time." I closed my eyes for a moment, standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed hard against my ear, and let that sentence settle into place. Nobody would have thought twice, of course. My father carried himself like a man above suspicion, a long-time church council member who had spent 30 years running a bank branch, well aware of exactly which paperwork needed to look convincing and which small details nobody downstream would ever bother checking twice. He knew how to make a stranger comfortable with a signature. That had been his entire career. No such document ever had my signature on it. I told her, that original letter never reached me. And I certainly never gave my father, or anyone else, permission to act on my behalf where that property was concerned. I need to understand exactly what your office has on file. Every page, every date, every name attached to any of it. There was a longer pause this time, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted into something more careful, more formal, the tone of someone reading from a script she'd only ever practiced in training. "Ms. Ellison, I think you should speak directly with one of our attorneys," she said. "This is a bit beyond what I'm able to advise on. Let me transfer you now, if you have a few minutes." I had considerably more than a few minutes. I had, apparently, an entire life's worth of assumptions about my own family that needed re-examining, and this call was only the first thread I intended to pull, however long the sweater underneath it turned out to be. Hold music filled my ear for close to 2 minutes, something inoffensive and orchestral, while I stood at my kitchen counter and watched my own hand, perfectly steady, resting flat against the granite as though bracing for something. Then a different voice picked up, more seasoned, more precise, carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent decades delivering hard news to clients without flinching. "This is Catherine Pierce," she said. "I understand you have concerns about the Vivian Ellison estate." I explained everything again, start to finish, the missing letter, the forged authorization, the loan I had never known existed until 3 days ago. She pulled the file while I spoke, occasionally asking a clarifying question, her voice growing quieter and more deliberate with each new detail I gave her. The way a good attorney's voice always does when the facts start adding up to something worse than the client initially described. "If everything you're telling me is accurate," she said finally, "and I have no reason at this point to think it isn't, then what we're looking at is forgery, unauthorized use of power of attorney, and a fraudulently obtained loan against real property. That's not a family disagreement, Ms. Ellison. That's a felony, potentially several of them, and I'd strongly recommend you retain your own counsel before you take another step. Someone who specializes in exactly this kind of fraud." I thanked her, told her I would be in touch, and set the phone down on the counter once the call ended, my hand still steady. though something underneath my ribs had gone tight and cold in a way I recognized from every serious case I'd ever worked. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, looking out at the skyline through my kitchen window, running through everything I now knew for certain instead of everything I only suspected. My father had lied to a law firm. My father had presented forged documentation to a licensed institution. My father had done this 2 years ago, and never once, at any holiday dinner, any casual phone call, any ordinary Tuesday, let anything in his voice suggest he was carrying something like that underneath the surface. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It had simply taken me 2 years to find the door that led to the truth. And now that I had it open, I had no intention of closing it again. I drove up to Door County that Saturday, 5 hours north out of the city, because some part of me needed to see the land itself before I let myself believe any further in numbers on a page. Numbers could be misread. A physical place couldn't lie to you the same way. Not with the particular stubbornness of trees and water and gravel that had been sitting exactly where they were for longer than anyone in my family had been alive. The drive gave me time to remember things I hadn't let myself sit with in years. The gravel crunch of the driveway under my grandmother's old station wagon. The particular blue of the water in late afternoon. Deeper than the lake back home. Colder even in August. The screened porch where she used to sit with a paperback balanced on her knee, glancing up every so often to make sure I hadn't drifted too far out past the dock, though she never once told me to come back in. She trusted me with distance in a way the rest of my family never quite managed to. Then, or since, I stopped once, about an hour outside the city, at a gas station with a faint smell like exhaust and concrete. My phone buzzed twice while I stood there, both texts from my mother, neither of which I opened. Whatever she wanted to say could wait until I'd seen this with my own eyes. I turned off the highway a little after 2, followed the narrower county road along the shoreline, and felt something in my chest loosen slightly at the first glimpse of the property through the trees. The small, cedar-shingled house still standing exactly as I remembered it, weathered gray, sturdy, patient, the kind of structure that looked like it had simply decided decades ago that it intended to outlast everyone who ever argued inside it. Then I saw the sign. It was staked near the end of the driveway, official-looking, laminated against the weather. The kind of notice that takes real effort to overlook once you've actually seen it. I got out of my car and walked toward it slowly, some part of me already bracing for what it would say before I was close enough to read the small print, my boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been raked in longer than I wanted to think about. Notice of default. A bank name I didn't recognize printed across the top. A loan number. A warning about missed payments accumulating over the past several months. A timeline for further action if the account wasn't brought current. I read it twice. Then a third time. The way I'd read the letter from Harrow and Pierce, trying to make the words mean something less final than what they clearly meant. I stood there in the gravel with my hand pressed against my mouth, staring at a piece of paper that confirmed, in the flattest possible language, everything Ruth's photocopies had only hinted at. This wasn't simply a forged signature buried in some old file, tucked away and forgotten. This was an active, live financial disaster, unfolding in real time, on land that legally belonged to me, and that I had never once been told was at risk of disappearing entirely. Whoever had taken out that loan hadn't just stolen from me once. They'd been failing to pay it back for months, quietly letting the consequences accumulate on a property 3 states away from anyone likely to notice, until a stranger's laminated notice was the only thing standing between my grandmother's land and total loss to a bank that had never once had my permission to touch it. I walked the rest of the way down to the house, unlocked the door with the spare key I still carried on my keyring out of pure sentiment, and stepped inside. Dust hung in the afternoon light, catching the sun in slow, drifting spirals. The furniture sat exactly where it always had, a little more faded now, a little more like a photograph of itself than an actual living space. I ran my hand along the back of the old couch, the same one I used to fall asleep on during thunderstorms, and let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what this place had meant to me before anyone had turned it into a line item on a fraudulent loan application. My grandmother used to tell me this house would be here long after everyone forgot what all their fighting had even been about. I hadn't understood as a kid what fighting she meant. Standing in her empty living room now, notice of default still folded in my jacket pocket, I understood it perfectly, and I felt something settle into place that was less like grief and more like resolve. I didn't stay long. I locked up, photographed the sign at the end of the driveway from every angle I could think of, close enough to read every printed word and wide enough to show exactly where it stood relative to the house, and got back in my car for the long drive home, already running through, in my head, exactly which documents I would need to pull the moment I got back to Chicago, and exactly who I would need to sit across a table from before this went any further without me. Back in Chicago on Sunday night, I logged into the county recorder's public database for Door County and started pulling every document tied to the Lakeshore Trail property, going back a full 5 years. Because I had learned a long time ago in my line of work that fraud rarely announces itself in a single document. It tends to show up in the seams between several, in the small inconsistencies nobody expects anyone to notice. The deed itself was clean, transferred to me by the terms of my grandmother's will a little under 3 years ago, exactly as I'd always believed. Nothing about the ownership itself had ever been in question, not on paper. What came after the deed was where things started to unravel, one filing at a time, each one a little worse than the last. I found the loan application first, filed roughly 2 years back, listing the borrower's name as Margot Ellington. I stared at that for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. Not Ellison, Ellington. A single letter swapped, close enough that a bank clerk skimming a stack of paperwork on a busy afternoon would never catch it. Close enough that even I, reading quickly the first time, had almost skimmed right past it myself. It was the kind of mistake a forger makes when they're moving fast, confident nobody downstream is checking closely enough to notice a single misplaced letter buried in a mountain of routine paperwork. A mistake that only mattered if somebody eventually went looking with the right kind of eyes. I pulled up the recorded power of attorney next, the same document Ruth had already shown me a version of, but this copy was clearer, the county's scan sharper than the photocopy in her envelope. I zoomed in on the signature line until the pixels started to blur, studying the shape of the letters the way I would study a disputed signature in any fraud case that crossed my desk. Comparing it against a dozen genuine signatures of mine I pulled up in a separate window just to be certain I wasn't imagining the difference. The G in my first name curved the wrong direction, looping left instead of right, a habit I had never once had in over 2 decades of signing my own name. The final stroke of the L in Ellison cut off early, abrupt, missing the small flourish I'd carried since college, the one my old roommate used to tease me about, calling it my lawyer's signature before I'd even become anything close to a lawyer. Someone had clearly practiced. They had gotten remarkably close, but close wasn't mine, and I had built an entire career on knowing the difference between close and authentic. Beneath the power of attorney, buried a few pages deeper in the recorded file, was the loan agreement itself. $510,000, secured against the full value of the Door County property, funded through a regional institution called Lakeshore Trust Bank. The authorized signer acting on my behalf, listed clearly across 2 separate pages, was my father, Walter Ellison. He hadn't just borrowed my name for a single signature. He had walked into a bank, presented himself as my authorized representative, negotiated terms, sat through whatever meetings that process required, and closed on a loan worth over $500,000, all while looking me in the eye at family dinners and never once mentioning any of it. Not even a passing comment that might have given something away. I sat back from my laptop and let that settle, the particular stillness that came over me whenever a case finally clicked fully into focus. All the disconnected pieces suddenly arranging themselves into a shape I couldn't unsee. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a single moment of poor judgment made under pressure. It was methodical, it was planned, step by step, document by document. Somebody had studied my signature closely enough to fake it convincingly, walked it into a bank, and left my grandmother's land exposed to default, while collecting $500,000 that had never once touched my own accounts or crossed my awareness in any form. I pulled the timeline together on a fresh page, cross-referencing every date against what I already knew. The loan closed 11 days after my father claimed, according to the law firm's records, to be managing my grandmother's estate on my behalf. 11 days. He hadn't wasted any time once the power of attorney was in hand, and that detail alone told me something about how confident he'd felt, how certain he must have been that nobody would ever go looking closely enough to catch it. I printed every page, organized them into a folder in the same order I would use for any client presentation, tabbed and labeled the way I'd been trained to do a decade ago, and sat at my kitchen table well past midnight, staring at my father's name in black and white beside a signature that was almost, but not quite, my own, I thought. Sitting there in the quiet, about every conversation I'd ever had with him about honesty, about the lecture he'd given me at 17 when I'd fudged a curfew and lied about where I'd been, the one about how a man's word was the only currency that actually mattered in this life, how a lie told once made every future truth harder for people to believe. He had said it with such conviction that I had carried it with me for years, had built parts of my own professional ethics around it without ever fully realizing where the instinct came from. Now I sat with proof, printed and notarized and filed with a county clerk, that he had forged his own daughter's signature to secure $500,000 he had never once mentioned. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the lecture had never really been about honesty at all. It had been about control, about who in that house got to decide what counted as the truth. And for 34 years, I had simply never been the one asking. I drove out to my parents' house in Naperville the next afternoon without calling ahead, the folder sitting on the passenger seat beside me the entire way, every red light along the route giving me one more minute to rehearse a conversation I already knew wouldn't go the way I'd rehearsed it. My mother opened the door, her expression shifting from surprised to wary within the space of about 2 seconds. The particular wariness of someone reading a person's face, and immediately sensing this wasn't a casual visit. "Margot," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "I need to talk to both of you," I said, stepping past her into the front hall before she could decide whether to invite me in. My father was already coming down the stairs, drawn by the sound of my voice, and something in his expression told me he understood, faster than my mother did, exactly what kind of visit this was about to become. He moved a little slower than usual, one hand trailing along the banister, and I wondered, watching him, whether some part of him had spent 2 years quietly waiting for this exact moment to arrive. I set the folder down on the kitchen table and opened it without any preamble, without any softening, laying the pages out one at a time the way I would for a client who needed to see the evidence in order before hearing my conclusions. The letter from Harrow and Pierce, the power of attorney, the loan documents, the notice of default I'd photographed at the property 2 days earlier. "Walter Ellison," I said, using his full name deliberately, watching it land on him like a small, precise blow. "Explain this to me. Explain why there's a $510,000 loan against grandmother's property, with your name listed as my authorized representative, and a signature on the power of attorney that isn't mine." My father's face went through several stages in the quick succession. Surprise, something close to panic, and then, infuriatingly, a kind of wounded defensiveness, as though I were the one who had done something wrong by finding out. "I was protecting this family," he said finally. "You don't understand the position we were in? Then help me understand it," I said. "Because from where I'm standing, you forged my signature and stole from your own daughter." "I did not steal," he said, his voice rising now, sharp in a way I rarely heard from him. "I made a decision under pressure to keep this family from falling apart. Someone had to be the strong one, Margot. Someone had to carry the weight. That's what family means. You of all people should understand that. You've been carrying weight for this family your whole life." "That's exactly the problem," I said, my own voice cutting through his. "I have been carrying weight for this family my whole life, and none of you ever once asked whether I wanted to keep carrying it. You just decided I would." My mother reached for his arm, her voice pitching into something placating. "Walter, maybe we should explain." I cut in, my own voice colder now than I think either of them had ever heard it. Not soften. Explain. "Renee, did you know about this?" She flinched slightly at hearing her first name instead of mother, and I watched something pass over her face. The recognition that whatever version of me she'd known for 34 years had just quietly ended, replaced by someone who intended to treat this conversation the same way she'd treat sworn testimony. "I knew there was a loan," she admitted quietly. "I didn't know the details. I didn't ask." "You didn't ask," I repeated. "You didn't ask how your husband was funding $500,000, using your other daughter's stolen identity, against land that was never his to touch. You just let it happen and told yourself that not asking made you innocent of it." Walter's jaw tightened, some last thread of composure finally slipping. "You have no idea the position we were in," he said again, quieter now, almost pleading. "Everything I did to hold this family together." "You didn't hold anything together." I said, "You held me together, financially, for years, without ever telling me that's what you were doing. And then you helped yourself to $500,000 of my inheritance without asking. And you're standing in this kitchen telling me it was an act of love." Neither of them answered that. The silence stretched long enough that the refrigerator's compressor clicked on somewhere behind me, an absurdly ordinary sound to hear in the middle of the worst conversation I'd ever had in this house. I picked the folder back up off the table myself, closed it, and looked at both of them one final time before I turned toward the door. "This isn't over," I said. "You'll be hearing from my attorney." Neither of them followed me to the door. I let myself out, crossed the driveway to my car, and sat behind the wheel for a full minute before I trusted my hands enough to start the engine, staring at the house I'd grown up in, the porch light my mother always left on even in daylight out of some old habit neither of us had ever discussed, the flower beds my father still edged himself every spring even now, retired, with nothing but time on his hands. It looked exactly the way it always had. Nothing about the outside of that house suggested what had just happened inside it, and something about that gap between how ordinary it all looked and how thoroughly it had just come apart stayed with me the entire drive back into the city, quieter and heavier than the anger had been. I found Carol Simmons's office listed online, a small notary and tax prep storefront wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner in a strip mall not far from my parents' neighborhood. the kind of place that survives on decades of repeat customers who trust a familiar face more than a familiar reputation. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to see her reaction unfiltered. The same way I preferred to walk into any interview without giving the subject time to rehearse. She recognized me the moment I walked through the door, and I watched the color drain slowly out of her face before either of us said a single word. There was a customer at the counter. An older man picking up a notarized deed of some kind. And Carol finished with him in a hurry, hands fumbling slightly with the paperwork, before she flipped the little sign on the door to closed and turned to face me properly. "Margot," she said, setting down the folder she'd been holding, "I wondered if you'd come. I need to ask you about a power of attorney you notarized about 2 years ago," I said, "for a property in Door County." She sank into the chair behind her desk rather than sat, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them together in front of her. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly. "I've thought about it more nights than I can count, more than I'd want to admit to you or to anyone." "Walk me through it," I said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even the parts that make you look bad. Your mother called me," she said, "frantic. She told me it was an emergency, that you were overwhelmed after your grandmother's passing and had asked your father to handle the estate paperwork so you wouldn't have to deal with it directly. She said it was just a formality, a quick signature to keep things moving before some deadline with the lender. Your father came in with the document already prepared. He signed his own portion in front of me. Your signature was already on the page when he handed it to me. You didn't verify it," I said. "You didn't call me, didn't ask for identification, nothing." "I should have," she said. And to her credit, she didn't try to argue the point or soften it with excuses. "Renee and I have known each other 30 years. Margot, we go to the same church. We've sat on the same committees. I've been to your parents' house more times than I can count. I trusted her word the way you trust anyone you've known that long. I know now how badly I misjudged that trust, and I think about it every single time I stamp a document now, wondering if I'm about to make the same mistake again with someone else. Did you know, at any point, what the document was actually being used for?" I asked. "Did you know about the loan?" "Not at first," she said. "Later, your mother let something slip. Something about Camille's situation finally being handled, and I put enough of it together on my own. By then it felt too late to undo anything, and I told myself it wasn't really my business what your family did with your own property. I know how that sounds now. I knew how it sounded then too, if I'm honest, and I did it anyway. It wasn't my family's property. I said, it was mine, and it still is." Carol's eyes filled, and for a moment she looked less like a woman protecting herself and more like someone genuinely frightened of what came next. Her hands still folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "I could lose my license over this," she said. "I could face charges. I know that. I'm not asking you to protect me. I don't think I deserve that. I just want you to know I'll tell the truth about all of it. Whatever you decide to do, to a lawyer, to the police, to anyone who asks me." "One more thing," I said before I let her off the hook even slightly. "The loan itself, do you know which bank handled it, or who processed the paperwork on their end?" She thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Lakeshore Trust," she said. "Your father mentioned once he'd worked with someone there personally, someone he already knew from his years managing his own branch. Back before he retired. I never got a name. I'm sorry, that's genuinely all I know. I never asked for more than I needed to get the signature done and get everyone out of my office." I thanked her, more out of habit than warmth, and left her sitting there in her small office with the weight of 30 years of misplaced trust finally catching up to her. I had a bank now. I had a name still missing. and I had every intention of finding it before this went any further. I sat in my car in the strip mall parking lot for a few minutes before I pulled out, watching a woman push a shopping cart across the lot toward the grocery store 2 doors down, entirely unaware of anything that had just happened a few feet away from her. I thought about Carol's face when she said she'd known, eventually, what the document had been used for, and had told herself it wasn't her business. I understood, in an uncomfortable way I hadn't expected to, exactly how a person talks themselves into that kind of silence. I had done a smaller version of it myself for years, telling myself the automatic payments I'd set up for my parents were simply generosity. Never once asking why generosity always seemed to flow in one direction in this family and never the other. Priya was already at my kitchen table when I got home, a habit she'd developed over the past week without either of us formally agreeing to it, letting herself up with the code I'd given her years ago for emergencies and showing up with takeout whenever she sensed I needed company more than I'd ever admit out loud. Tonight it was containers of Pad CU going cold on the counter while I walked her through everything. Carol Simmons, the notarized lie, the mention of Lakeshore Trust Bank, and a name still missing from the picture. Priya listened the way she always did, completely still, her reporter's instincts visibly sharpening the longer I talked, until I finished, and she sat back in her chair with an expression I recognized from years of watching her chase down a story that had just cracked open wider than she'd expected. She pulled her knees up onto the chair, arms wrapped around them, the posture she'd had since graduate school whenever a problem finally had her full attention. Lakeshore Trust, she repeated. That name's familiar? Give me a second. She pulled out her laptop, and I watched her fingers move fast across a database I recognized as one she used for background research, cross-referencing old notes, old drafts, half-finished investigations she'd never had enough on the record to publish. After a few minutes, her expression shifted into something sharper, the screen's glow catching the tightness around her eyes. I pitched a story on this bank almost 2 years ago, she said. Never got enough to run it. There were at least 2 other complaints filed with state regulators around that time, both involving home equity loans that families said they never authorized, both tied to properties that had recently changed hands after a relative's death. I couldn't get anyone to go on record, and my editor killed it for lack of sourcing. I remember being frustrated about it for weeks. Something about it felt bigger than what I could prove at the time. I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, the particular chill of realizing a pattern is larger than the single case sitting in front of you. This wasn't only about my family, I said slowly. This is happening to other people too. It might be, Priya said carefully. I don't want to get ahead of the evidence. That's not how I work, and it's not how you work either. But if there's a specific loan officer at that bank connected to multiple suspicious files, that's not a coincidence anymore. That's a pattern. And patterns mean somebody built a system for doing this more than once, refined it, got comfortable with it. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I would turn over an anomaly that suddenly widened the scope of an investigation far beyond where it started. My appetite for the cooling noodles in front of me having entirely disappeared. I need a name, I said. Whoever processed the loan on our file? Carol didn't have one. The recorded documents list the bank, but not an individual loan officer directly, not in the parts I've pulled so far. I might need the full internal file for that, not just what's public record. Then you need someone with actual legal standing to compel the rest of the file, Priya said. I can dig around the edges all day, but I can't make a bank hand over internal records, and neither can you, not without a subpoena backing you up. You need a lawyer. Margot, a real one, who specializes in exactly this. I know you've been trying to handle this the way you handle everything, quietly, on your own, methodically. But this is bigger than a spreadsheet now. This is a case, and cases need people with the authority to actually compel answers. She was right, and some stubborn, exhausted part of me hated that she was right, because hiring an attorney meant admitting, officially, formally, that this had moved past the point where family conversations or careful documentation alone could resolve it. That I was no longer capable of untangling this by myself, no matter how good I was at my own job. "I know someone," Priya added, before I could talk myself out of it. "Dana Marsh. Real estate and financial fraud, mostly. She's sharp, and she doesn't scare easily, which I think is exactly what you're going to need for whatever's still underneath this." "Set it up," I told her, and felt something settle into place inside me. The particular calm that always arrived once I'd stopped circling a decision and finally committed to it. Whatever this pattern turned out to be, I intended to see the whole shape of it before I decided how far I was willing to take it. Priya stayed another hour after that, not talking business anymore, just sitting with me while I finally ate a few bites of the noodles and let the conversation drift towards smaller things. A case she was working on. A terrible date her cousin had gone on the week before. Anything that wasn't loan documents or forged signatures. It was the first hour in nearly 2 weeks that hadn't felt like it was actively costing me something to sit through, and when she finally gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at me for a moment. "You know this isn't your fault, right?" she said. "None of it. Not the party, not the money, not any of it." "I know," I said. Though we both understood I didn't fully believe it yet. Not all the way down. Some part of me was still doing the math on what I could have caught sooner if I'd been paying closer attention, and I suspected it would take longer than a week of investigation to talk myself all the way out of that particular habit. Dana Marsh's office occupied the 14th floor of a building downtown. All dark wood paneling and framed diplomas. The kind of space designed to make a client feel like their problem was already halfway solved simply by walking through the door. She met me in the lobby herself rather than sending an assistant, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with the particular energy of someone who had spent decades listening to people's worst days without ever letting it show on her own face. "Priya speaks highly of you," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "She also told me this was urgent. Let's not waste time. Start from the beginning. In your own words." I hadn't been asked to tell the whole story in my own words since the day it started, and something about the invitation nearly caught in my throat before I steadied myself and began, methodically, the same way I would open any case file. The party, Ruth's envelope, the forged power of attorney, the loan against my grandmother's land, Carol Simmons and her 30 years of misplaced trust, Priya's half-finished investigation into the bank itself, the pattern of similar complaints nobody had ever been able to substantiate. Dana listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so small and precise it looked almost typed, occasionally stopping me to clarify a date or a dollar figure, but otherwise letting the whole account unfold at its own pace, the way a good attorney lets a client's story breathe before she starts shaping it into something usable. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "This signature," she said, tapping the photocopy of the power of attorney, "you're certain this isn't yours? I've signed my own name close to 100,000 times in my career." I told her, "This isn't mine. Not close enough to fool anyone who actually looked closely. And I looked very closely. And the notary." She said, "Would she testify to what she told you?" "I believe she would," I said. She seemed genuinely afraid of what happens next, but not afraid enough to lie for anyone at this point. I think 30 years of guilt finally caught up with her the day I walked into her office. Dana nodded slowly, flipping back through her notes. "What you have here," she said, "is one of the more complete fraud cases I've encountered in 15 years of doing this work. Forgery of a legal instrument. Fraudulent use of power of attorney. A loan obtained through misrepresentation, secured against real property you never agreed to encumber. Individually. Any one of these is serious. Together. This is the kind of file that ends in a courtroom, one way or another, regardless of what your family would prefer. She laid out my options with the same clinical clarity I used with my own clients, ticking each one off on her fingers as she spoke. I could pursue criminal charges, which would mean involving the district attorney and accepting whatever public exposure came with that. I could file a civil suit to recover the property's value plus damages, slower, but more within my control, less dependent on a prosecutor's caseload and priorities. Or I could send a formal demand first, giving my family a defined window to make this right before either of those other paths became necessary. Most people in your position start with the demand letter, she said. It's the fastest route, and it puts the burden back on them to decide how much worse this gets. But it only works if they believe you're genuinely prepared to escalate if they don't respond seriously. Half-hearted threats don't move people like your father. Documented, credible ones do. I am prepared, I said. And I meant it in a way that surprised even me. A certainty that had been building quietly for 2 weeks and had finally arrived somewhere solid, somewhere I could stand on without wobbling. Then let's draft something worth taking seriously, Dana said, already reaching for a fresh legal pad, full restitution, a deadline, and language specific enough that nobody in that family mistakes this for an emotional overreaction rather than exactly what it is. A formal legal demand backed by evidence that would hold up anywhere we chose to take it. We spent the next hour building the letter together, line by line, arguing briefly over a single phrase about interest calculations before settling on wording we both found acceptable, until it said everything it needed to say, and nothing it didn't. Before I left, Dana asked one more question, setting her pen down and studying me with the kind of attention that felt less like a lawyer wrapping up a meeting and more like someone genuinely curious about the answer. Have you thought about what happens to your relationship with them after this? She asked. Not the legal outcome, the actual relationship. Some clients want the money and nothing else changes. Some clients want the money and understand that everything changes. I want to make sure you know which one you are before we send this. I sat with that question longer than I expected to, turning it over the way she'd clearly intended me to. I don't think I get to choose which one I am. I finally said, I think that got decided the day they chose a party over me and lied about it afterward. I'm just the one who finally noticed. Dana nodded, seemingly satisfied, and walked me out to the elevator herself. By the time I left her office, the sun had already dropped behind the skyline, and for the first time since Ruth's first phone call, I felt something that wasn't quite peace, but was at least the beginning of control. The letter went out by certified mail and email on a Wednesday morning, and I knew the moment it landed, because my phone had gone almost completely silent for 2 weeks, and then, within the space of about 3 hours that afternoon, exploded back to life all at once. My father's voicemail came first, left at 2:30, his voice tight in a way that told me he was working hard to sound calm and failing at it. Margot, we received something from an attorney's office. This is a misunderstanding that's gotten completely out of hand. Call me back so we can talk about this like a family. He left a second voicemail 4 minutes later. Shorter this time, just my name and a long pause before he hung up, as though he'd started to say something and thought better of it partway through. My mother's text arrived 7 minutes later. How could you do this to us? We are your parents. After everything we've given you. This is how you repay us. I read that line twice, the sheer inversion of it almost admirable in its audacity. The kind of rhetorical sleight of hand I'd seen countless times in fraud cases, where the person caught taking something always finds a way to reframe themselves as the one who was owed everything they had given me As though the $58,000 had flowed in the opposite direction. As though the years of quiet automatic payments had somehow been a gift my parents extended to me rather than the other way around. As though a forged signature and $500,000 quietly siphoned off my grandmother's land constituted some kind of gift I was now ungratefully rejecting. I didn't respond to either message. I let them sit, the way Donna had advised me to, unanswered, because a response of any kind, even an angry one, would only hand them something to react to, some thread of engagement to pull on until they'd talked me back into softening, back into the version of myself who apologized for other people's choices. Around 4, a different message came through, one I hadn't expected quite so soon. Camille. Mom just called me completely hysterical. It read, something about a lawyer and Grandma's land and Dad's name on some loan. What is happening? Why didn't anyone tell me any of this? I stared at that message for a long moment, reading it 3 separate times, turning it over the way I would turn over an unexpected piece of testimony in the middle of a case I thought I'd already mapped fully. A witness statement that didn't fit the version of events I'd assumed I already understood. There was something in the tone, the specific confusion, the exclamation points. That didn't read like performance to me. It read like someone genuinely blindsided, which meant either my parents had done an excellent job keeping her insulated from the details, or she was a far better actor than I'd ever given her credit for, and I genuinely couldn't decide, sitting there staring at my phone, which possibility unsettled me more. I didn't respond to her either, not yet. I wasn't ready to decide, with any confidence, which version of my sister I was actually looking at. And I didn't want to say anything I might need to walk back later once I knew more. Part of me wanted, badly, to believe the confusion in her message was real, that some part of her had been kept as much in the dark as I had. But I had learned enough in the last 2 weeks not to trust my own wanting over the evidence, whenever the two happened to disagree. Instead, I sat with all 3 messages open in front of me and noticed the thing they had in common, the thing that told me everything I needed to know about how this family still saw the situation even now, with documented forgery sitting in a lawyer's file. Not one of them had asked whether I was all right. Not one of them had acknowledged, even briefly, what had actually been done to me. Every message circled back to their own confusion, their own inconvenience, their own sense that I owed somebody an explanation for finally defending myself, that the burden of soothing everyone's feelings still, somehow, belonged to me. I closed my phone, set it face down on the counter, and let the silence hold for the rest of the evening. The particular quiet that comes right before a case finally tips from suspicion into something that can no longer be walked back by anyone involved. I made myself dinner I barely tasted, washed the single plate and fork by hand instead of leaving them in the sink, and sat by the window a long while, watching the lights of the city come on one building at a time. Around 9. My phone lit up once more, and I almost ignored it entirely before I saw it was Ruth. Not asking anything, not defending anyone, just 3 words. Proud of you. I read it twice, and something in my chest that had been braced all day finally eased half an inch. Out of everyone connected to this family, Ruth was the only one who seemed to understand that this wasn't a rupture I had caused. It was a rupture I had simply stopped hiding. And there was a difference between the two, that apparently only she, among all of them, was willing to name out loud. I typed back a single word, "Thank you," and set the phone down again, and for the first time all day, the silence in my apartment felt less like something I was enduring and more like something I had actually chosen. Dana's paralegal called me in on Friday morning to review the complete loan file, the version the bank's counsel had finally released under the pressure of the demand letter. Thicker now than anything Ruth or the county records had shown me. page after page of underwriting notes and processing timestamps I hadn't seen before. We sat together in the small conference room down the hall from Dana's office. The paralegal, a quiet, thorough young man named Owen, walking me through each section methodically, flagging anything that looked procedurally unusual. Sticky notes already marking 3 separate pages before we'd even sat down. Most of it confirmed what I already knew. The forged authorization, the inflated property valuation someone had rushed through without a proper in-person appraisal, the appraiser's signature dated the same day as the site visit. An impossible turnaround. Owen circled twice in red. The funds dispersed directly into an account tied to my father, routed through 2 intermediate transfers before landing somewhere I still hadn't traced fully. Near the back of the file, tucked into the processing notes behind a stack of internal approval memos nobody outside the bank was ever meant to see, was a line I hadn't seen in any of the earlier documents. The internal loan officer assigned to the file, listed only by a first initial and last name the way bank systems often abbreviated things. Easy to miss, unless you were reading every line the way I had trained myself to. P. Vale. I stared at it for a moment, something faintly familiar snagging at the edge of my memory without fully resolving into anything I could name. I'd heard that name recently. I was almost certain of it, though I couldn't immediately place where or in what context, the way a word sometimes surfaces without its source attached, hovering just out of reach no matter how hard I reached for it. "Does it mean something to you?" Owen asked, watching my expression shift. "I'm not sure yet." I told him honestly. "It's familiar. Give me a second. I know I've heard it, recently, somewhere completely outside of work." I scrolled back through my own recent messages, half expecting the answer to jump out at me the moment I saw it in writing. And there it was, 3 days old, sitting near the top of my thread with Camille. My phone rang before the second had a chance to fully pass. Camille's name lit up the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail, still turning the loan officer's name over in my mind. But something made me answer instead. Some instinct I would later be grateful I'd listened to. "Hey," she said, her voice bright, careful, the tone of someone testing whether it was safe to sound normal again. "I know things are weird right now, and I'm not trying to pretend they're not. But Preston and I were talking, and we wanted to do something small to celebrate before everything with the wedding planning gets crazy. Nothing huge, just close family. I was thinking maybe we could do it at your place. Your penthouse has that incredible view, and honestly, it would mean a lot to have it somewhere that felt like you were really part of it." I sat very still in that small conference room, the loan file open in front of me. P. Vale printed in plain black ink 3 lines above where my fingers still rested on the page, and felt something cold and precise click into place before I'd even consciously finished the thought. The particular sensation of 2 separate cases suddenly revealing themselves to be the exact same case. "Preston," I said slowly. "What's his last name again?" "Vale," Camille said, a small, confused laugh in her voice. "Preston Vale. You've met him twice. Margot, come on, at Mom's birthday dinner and then again at Easter, remember. He brought that terrible wine you were too polite to say anything about." I looked down at the file again. Vale. I let a beat pass, keeping my voice as light and unreadable as I could manage. Every year of professional training I had going into holding my tone perfectly level. "Let me think about it," I told her. "I'll call you back." I hung up before she could push further, and sat there in the sudden ringing silence of that conference room, staring at a name on a page that had, apparently, just walked directly into the center of my family without any of us noticing what he'd already done to it, close enough that I had shaken his hand, close enough that I had sat across a table from him and made small talk about a wine list, close enough that he had been, for months now, one dinner conversation away from becoming family in every sense that mattered. Owen was watching me carefully, his pen still resting on the last page he'd flagged. "You went pale," he said. "Are you all right? I need you to pull everything this bank has on a Preston Vale," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Every file he's touched in the last 3 years, not just ours." "Can you do that today? I can put in the request today," he said. "Whether we get it today depends on how much Dana wants to push." "Do you want me to call her right now?" "Yes," I said. "Tell her it's not a normal file request anymore. Tell her the loan officer on our case is engaged to my sister, and he's going to be standing in my living room in 3 weeks if I don't figure out exactly what I'm dealing with before then." Owen didn't ask any follow-up questions. He simply nodded, gathered his legal pad, and left the conference room at something close to a jog, and I sat alone for a long moment with the file still open in front of me. The coffee I'd ordered an hour earlier gone completely cold. Listening to my own pulse in my ears the way I hadn't since the very first night Ruth called. I once believed the betrayal in this family began and ended with my father, that once his name was on every document Dana needed, the worst of it would finally be behind me. I was wrong in a way I hadn't even begun to understand yet. The name on that loan file was about to walk into my home wearing a suit and a ring meant for my sister's finger, introduced to every guest in the room as family. And none of them, not Camille, not my parents, not one single person who would raise a glass to him in a few weeks' time, had any idea yet what he actually was, or how close he had already come to sitting at their table unquestioned. I closed the file, gathered my things, and walked out of that conference room already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way I always did when a case finally showed me its real shape. Somewhere between the elevator and the parking garage, I stopped being only a victim in this story. By the time I reached my car, I had started becoming something else entirely. I called Priya from the parking garage before I'd even made it back to my car, still standing between 2 concrete pillars with the loan file clutched against my chest, like something that might slip away if I loosened my grip. "Preston Vale," I said, the second she picked up. "Camille's fiancé. Tell me that's not the same name on this loan file." There was a pause on her end, the particular pause of someone pulling up a search bar. I heard typing, rapid, then a sharp intake of breath. "Margot," she said slowly, "Senior Loan Officer, Lakeshore Trust, Downtown Branch. Same bank, same title as the one flagged in those old complaints I mentioned. This isn't a coincidence, is it?" "I don't think it is," I said, my voice steadier than I actually felt, though my free hand had found the cold concrete pillar beside me and was pressing against it like I needed the surface to stay upright. "He's engaged to my sister. He's been at family dinners. He's been sitting across the table from the people he apparently helped rob, and none of us had any idea." "We need everything on him," Priya said. Already moving into the register I recognized from her most focused reporting. Every file, every complaint, every name attached to a property he's ever touched. "Give me the rest of the day. I will," I said, "but there's something I need to do first. And I need you to not talk me out of it." Camille had asked, only an hour earlier, whether she and Preston could host a small celebration at my penthouse. My first instinct, the animal, unthinking part of me, had wanted to refuse outright. To protect that space the same way I'd protected everything else in my life that this family had never bothered to earn. But standing there in the gray concrete quiet of the garage, another instinct entirely had started to take shape. Colder, more deliberate, the exact kind of instinct that had built my entire career. If Preston Vale was going to walk into my home believing himself untouchable, I intended to make sure he did it under circumstances I controlled completely. "I'm going to say yes," I told Priya. "To the party. I want him relaxed. I want him confident. And I want enough evidence in place by the time he walks through my door that there's no version of that night where he leaves it a free man. Margot, Priya said carefully. That's not nothing. That's a real operation, not a personal decision. You'd need actual law enforcement involved, not just us digging around on our own. And you'd need to be careful about how much of this you do yourself before you loop them in. I know, I said, which is why I'm about to make a second call. I hung up with her, scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I hadn't used in over a year, and pressed call before I could talk myself out of it a second time, my thumb hovering over the screen for a full second longer than it needed to. Detective Ford? A voice answered. Brisk, professional, exactly as I remembered her from the insurance fraud case that had first brought us into each other's orbit 2 years earlier. Detective, it's Margot Ellison, I said. From the Heartline case 2 years back. I know this is out of nowhere, but I need to talk to you about something. It's financial fraud. It's serious, and it's happening inside my own family right now. Tonight. This week. I think I can hand you exactly what you need to make an arrest. But I need help building the last piece of it. And I need it done quietly, without anyone in my family finding out I've made this call. There was a brief pause on her end, the sound of a chair shifting, papers being set aside, someone else's conversation fading in the background before a door apparently closed on it. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out, even the parts you think might not matter. I looked down at the loan file still clutched against my chest, at Preston Vale's name printed in flat, indifferent black ink, and began, standing there in the gray afternoon light of a parking garage, laying out every detail in the same steady voice I would have used with any client, while some quieter part of me registered, almost with surprise, how calm I actually sounded. It took nearly 20 minutes to walk Ford through everything: the forged power of attorney, the loan against my grandmother's land, Carol Simmons and her 30 years of misplaced trust, and now Preston, sitting at the center of it all wearing a face none of us had thought to question. Ford asked sharp, specific questions as I went, the address of the bank branch, the exact wording on the loan document's authorized signer line, whether I had the original notice of default still in my possession. By the time I finished, she'd stopped sounding merely interested and started sounding like someone already 3 steps ahead, already building the shape of an operation in her head. "This is good," she said finally. "This is more than good, actually. It's exactly the kind of corroborating detail we've been missing on our end for months. I want to bring in someone from the financial examiner's office, too. If you're willing to let this play out over a slightly longer timeline than tonight, can you give me until the party to put the right people in place? I can give you 3 weeks, I told her. That's how long we have until it happens at my apartment. Then let's use every day of it, Ford said. And for the first time since Ruth's original phone call, I felt like I was finally standing on the other side of the table from this family instead of underneath it. Priya called me back just after 10 that night, and I could hear, in the particular rhythm of her voice, that she'd found something that had shaken even her. And Priya's threshold for being shaken by financial paperwork was considerably higher than most people's. Built up over a decade of reading things most people would rather not know existed. I found the 2 complaints I remembered, she said, both filed with the state banking regulator, both dismissed for insufficient evidence, both involving home equity loans nobody in the family claimed to have authorized. But once I had his name to search against, I found 3 more. Margot. 3 more I never even knew existed, buried in county records across 2 other states, filed under slightly different spellings of his name that made them almost impossible to find unless you already knew what you were looking for. 5 total, I said slowly, the number settling into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sinking further the longer I sat with it. 5 that I could find in an afternoon, Priya said. There are probably more that never made it into any searchable database at all, more that got resolved quietly before anyone ever filed a formal complaint. And here's the part that actually turned my stomach. Every single one of them involves a property that changed hands recently, after an older relative passed away. Every single one involves an heir who didn't fully understand what they'd inherited yet, who wasn't watching the paperwork closely because they were still grieving, still distracted, still trusting the people around them to handle things properly. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I would turn over the discovery of a fraud ring at work. Except this one had a face I recognized from Thanksgiving, a voice I'd heard laugh at my father's jokes, hands that had, at some family dinner months ago, refilled my wine glass without me thinking twice about it. Hands I now understood had been doing something like this for years, methodically, to families exactly like mine. This isn't opportunistic, I said finally. This is a method. He's built an entire practice around finding families in exactly this kind of vulnerable moment, and getting close enough to them that nobody ever thinks to check his work. That's what it looks like to me. Priya agreed. And Margot, I have to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Do you believe he targeted your family on purpose, that he found your grandmother's estate first, and Camille second? I turned the question over slowly, running through every memory I had of Preston, the low-key charm of him, the easy way he'd folded himself into family gatherings within weeks of meeting Camille, always helpful, always available, always somehow present exactly when financial conversations came up at the dinner table. Always the first to offer some small piece of banking advice that, in hindsight, had probably been steering the conversation exactly where he wanted it. I don't know, I admitted, and honestly, I don't think it matters for what happens next. Whether he found Camille and then discovered the land, or found the land and then engineered his way to Camille, the outcome is identical. He used his position, and he used my family. And either way, he doesn't walk away from this untouched. Priya was quiet for a moment. What about her? She finally asked. Camille. Have you thought about what this actually does to her? Once it comes out. I had thought about it, more than I wanted to admit, in the hours since I'd hung up on Camille's request to use my apartment, whatever came next. My sister was either about to lose the man she believed she was marrying, or discover she'd been engaged to someone capable of an entirely different kind of family betrayal than the one she'd already helped orchestrate against me. And I genuinely didn't know yet which version of that outcome I was more afraid of for her. I don't know what she knew or didn't know, I told Priya honestly. But I know she deserves to see the truth with her own eyes, in real time, instead of hearing some sanitized version of it secondhand later, filtered through whatever version our parents decide to tell her. That's the one thing I can still control here. Then let's build you a night she can't misunderstand, Priya said quietly. And for the first time since Ruth's original phone call weeks earlier, I felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger settle into place instead. Something closer to purpose. Something with an actual shape and a direction I could walk toward. Before we hung up, Priya asked one more question, quieter than the rest. Are you scared, she asked, not of him getting caught, of what it's going to feel like, standing in your own home when it happens? I thought about that honestly before I answered, turning my water glass slowly on the counter the way I'd taken to doing lately whenever a question required more care than a quick response would allow. A little, I admitted. Mostly, I'm scared of the version of this where I chicken out halfway through and let him walk away because it got uncomfortable. I don't think I get to be that person anymore. You were never going to be that person, Priya said, and something in her voice told me she meant it completely. I've known you 12 years. Margot, you've never once let uncomfortable stop you from doing the right thing. You just don't usually have to do it to your own family. No. I agreed quietly. I don't. Detective Ford met me the next morning at a small office inside the Financial Crimes Unit, a cramped room with a whiteboard still covered in someone else's case notes, half erased, and 2 chairs pulled up to a table that looked like it had hosted 100 conversations exactly like the one we were about to have. The surface scarred with old coffee rings nobody had ever bothered to wipe clean. She hadn't changed much since the Heartline case. Still the same closely cropped hair, the same direct way of looking at a person that made you feel like you were already under mild interrogation before you'd said a single word. She'd pulled a legal pad in front of her and had a pen ready before I'd even finished sitting down, and a second folder sat closed beside it that she hadn't opened yet, which I suspected was deliberate. "Walk me through everything," she said. "Don't skip anything because you think it's not relevant. Let me decide what's relevant. I laid it out for her the way I'd laid it out for Dana, for Priya, for Ruth in that first diner booth weeks ago. Except this time, I included the loan officer's name from the start. And I watched Ford's expression sharpen the moment I said it. Her pen going still against the page. "Preston Vale," she repeated, writing it down and underlining it twice, hard enough that I could see the indent through the next page of the pad. "That name's already familiar to me, Ms. Ellison. He's come up peripherally in another file we've had open for about 8 months. Nothing solid enough yet to move on. But enough that I've had his name flagged for a while now, sitting in a drawer I hadn't had a reason to reopen until this morning." "You already suspected him," I said. "Suspected isn't the same as having a case," she said. "What you've handed me today is the first thing solid enough to actually build on. A documented forgery, a traceable loan file, a witness willing to testify to the notarization, and now a direct personal connection between the suspect and the victim's own family, which frankly, in 8 months of chasing paper trails, is more than I've had on him this entire time." She finally opened the second folder, sliding it around so I could see a handful of photographs and printed emails I didn't recognize. "This is what we had before you walked in. It's thin. What you brought me is the spine this whole thing was missing." She flipped back through her notes, tapping her pen against the pad. "Here's what I want to propose," she said. "You mentioned your sister asked to hold some kind of celebration at your residence. If that's still on the table, that's actually the best possible scenario for us." Vale relaxed, off guard, surrounded by people he has no reason to suspect are watching him closely. "If we can get a financial examiner in the building discreetly, document any conversation where he references the loan or the property even obliquely, and have officers positioned to move the moment we have what we need, we could close this cleanly, in one night, instead of dragging out a slower investigation that gives him time to notice he's been made and disappear with whatever he's still got access to." "You want to use the party," I said. "I want to use the opportunity you're already being handed," she said. "I know that's not a small thing to ask of you, hosting the man who helped steal from your own family in your own home, smiling at him across a room while you already know exactly what he is. But if you're willing, it's the cleanest path I can offer you to an actual arrest instead of years of civil litigation that might never touch him personally at all." I thought about Camille's voice on the phone, bright and hopeful, asking if the party could happen somewhere that felt like I was really part of it. I thought about my grandmother's land, still sitting under a notice of default 3 states away. I thought about every quiet, unacknowledged year I'd spent being the reliable one, the one who absorbed whatever needed absorbing so everyone else's life could stay comfortable. And I felt sitting in that cramped office. Something hardened in me that I suspected wasn't going to soften back down anytime soon. "I'm willing," I told her. "Tell me exactly what you need from me, and I'll make sure it's in place before he walks through my door." Ford studied me for a moment, the way I imagined she studied every witness before deciding how much weight to put on their word, then nodded once, decisively. "Then let's get to work," she said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward her. "We have 3 weeks, and I intend to use every single day of them, before I left." She walked me through the basic shape of what the next few weeks would look like. "Mostly quiet on my end," she said, "mostly paperwork and coordination on hers. A financial examiner from the state banking division would need to review everything Donna's office had compiled. Someone would need to run a full background check on Preston that went deeper than anything Priya could pull on her own. And I would need to keep behaving, in every visible way. Exactly like a woman who had simply agreed to host her sister's engagement party. Nothing more complicated than that. "Can you do that?" she asked. "Can you sit across a table from him at some point between now and then and act like nothing's wrong? I've spent 34 years learning how to sit across a table from people in this family and act like nothing's wrong." I told her, "This won't be the hardest version of that I've ever done." Something in her expression shifted slightly at that. Not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it. "Then I think we're going to work well together," she said, and stood to walk me out. I called Camille back that evening, and it took everything I had to keep my voice light when she picked up on the first ring, clearly braced for